As World Food Day was celebrated yesterday, 821 million people in the world are hungry. Of those, 256.1 million are in Africa. Now, according to the 2019 State of Food Security in the World by the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, the report indicates that Africa has the highest proportion of undernourishment at almost 20%. What can be done to increase food security? We see huge food waste in certain areas, locally and internationally. Now, can these practices be changed to help feed those in need? To help answer these questions, I'm joined by Gerald Bourke, the spokesperson for the UN Southern African World Food Programme. Gerald, a pleasure to have you on the program this afternoon. Now, according to the 2019 report into the state of food and security and nutrition in the world, poor rainfall, drought, continues to pose risk to food security. Just take us through water shortages on the African continent and the impact that this poses.
Sure. Climate change is a huge problem, not least here in southern Africa. We've had in this region over the last 5 years only one normal rainy season, one normal growing season. And of course that has impacted harvests, yields, food security, aggravating food insecurity. Another major factor on the continent, of course, is conflict as a contributor to hunger. We have wars in Burkina Faso, northeastern Nigeria, South Sudan, and then closer to home, eastern DRC and northern Mozambique. And on top of that, we have a lot of economic disarray, very challenged governments in terms of indebtedness, fiscal deficits, etc. And then the major compounding factor over the last several months has been COVID-19. So you got a very toxic cocktail that makes for a much worse situation, particularly in the last 8 to 10 months.
Now, given this cocktail that you speak of, what needs to be done, in your opinion, to increase food security on the continent?
Well, a couple of things. On the conflict side, obviously we need peace in those places which are war-torn. So we need those with an ability to influence the warring parties to step up and exert that influence. On the climate side, we need stronger, more widespread mitigation and adaptation efforts. One of the things that the World Food Programme does, in addition to dealing with the consequences of conflict and climate change, we have a very strong emergency component. About 80% of our work is in response to those emergencies, wars, sudden natural disasters like the cyclones that hit southern Africa last year, or the more slow-burning emergencies like drought. So one of the things that we do, in addition to tackling the emergency impacts, is to seek to render vulnerable communities self-sufficient so that they can withstand the impacts of climate change when they strike, the storms and the droughts, etc. So more of that needs to be done.
Now, Gerald, we marked World Food Day yesterday, and we see high food wastage figures in certain areas, both locally and internationally. Now, can these practices be changed to help feed those who are in need?
Well, it's up to each of us to assume the responsibility. The numbers are absolutely staggering, as you suggest. 1.3 billion tons of food that is wasted every year, and that's enough to feed 2 billion people. I mean, that's the supreme irony of this entire hunger situation. The world produces more than enough food to feed everybody on the planet, and yet you have so much want, so much need. It's a tragedy. It's essentially unacceptable.
Now, in response, the UN World Food Programme has highlighted agriculture as the backbone of the economy in Africa, with 89% of rural households practicing small-scale farming. Now, is this proving to be effective to counter food insecurity?
Well, it is what it is, and in fact, one of the biggest proportions of hungry people, for example, in this region, are the smallholder farmers who, ironically, produce most of the region's food. The World Food Programme, during the lean season, between harvests, devotes a lot of resources, a lot of energy, a lot of money to assisting smallholders who simply cannot get by. And again, climate change is a major factor here. The scientists tell us, for example, that something like 40% of the land in sub-Saharan Africa that is presently under maize will be unusable for that purpose in as little as 10 years because it'll be too hot and too dry. And we must bear in mind that maize accounts for 70% of southern Africa's total cereal production. So there's a lot to be done.
Let's continue to focus on the response on the continent. What more would you say that governments on the continent need to be doing to fight hunger?
Well, just on the issue of maize, for example, one of the things that the World Food Programme is doing as part of these efforts to render vulnerable communities self-sufficient is to encourage the smallholders to produce crops other than maize. Things like sorghum and millet, which are indigenous, more nutritious than maize, and more drought resistant, which obviously is very important.
Let's now take a look at practical examples. I mean, if you look at a country like Zimbabwe, this is a country that was once called the breadbasket of Africa. It's a completely different story now because of the economic instability in that country, and many have had to contend with the poverty and hunger, of course. What would you say are some of the lessons that need to be learned from this Zimbabwe example?
Yeah, Zimbabwe is a very sad case. The World Food Programme has had, over the last few years, increasingly large response programs there. I mentioned the lean season earlier on. We had a lean season operation for 2021 that ran all the way to the end of July. Now, bearing in mind that the harvest comes in April, so the months immediately after April are the period when the country is relatively flush with food. But as I say, we had to have a lean season assistance program for the worst off that ran until the end of July of this year. And the 2020-2021 lean season assistance program began on the 1st of August. So that's an indication of the gravity of the situation, the depth and breadth of hunger in Zimbabwe. And as you mentioned, there's the economic disarray, huge problems. And being a voluntarily funded organization, we are only as good as the amount of resources that we manage to mobilize. And for Zimbabwe, as for elsewhere in this region and indeed elsewhere in Africa, we never managed to mobilize the full amounts of money or food that we need to completely execute our intended programs.
Gerald Bourke there from the UN World Food Programme.